Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Keri Blakinger. Now, Keri is a journalist and she's based in America. She's a journalist at the Marshall Project, which is a non-profit organization focused on criminal justice. Keri's written for numerous publications across America, and we'll find out if she's written anything in the UK in a moment. But Keri's also the first formerly incarcerated reporter and has written a memoir, which I believe is out next year. So, Keri, it's great to get you on the Godcast. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. And you're in where? Tell everybody where you are in the US today.
Right now, I am in Houston, Texas.
And is that a cool place? Tell us a little bit about Houston. It's not a place that maybe many people in the UK are familiar with.
Well, Houston is the fourth largest city here. I mean, in the country, not just in Texas. It is, I'm not from here originally, but I live here now, and I think people think of Texas as being, just sort of redneck conservative cowboys, right? But Houston is not that at all. It's a diverse metropolitan city. We have Democrats in charge of, city council and the county commissioner's court, and most of the judicial benches. But it hasn't always been that way. And that is part of why Harris County, Houston is in Harris County. Harris County has been for a long time known as the capital of capital punishment, because Harris County has sent more people to death row and had, more people actually be executed than any other entire state, except for the rest of Texas. So, when it comes to covering criminal justice in a place like this, it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, today it's a diverse, progressive city, but on the other hand, it's got this legacy of being an extremely punitive, tough on crime place that was very invested in the death penalty, which makes it a perfect place to be a reporter who covers prisons and capital punishment.
So, at the height of that, Keri, how many people would be executed in a year?
So, in 1999, 2000, somewhere around there was when this peaked. And at that point in Texas as a whole, I think the peak was a little over 40 executions in 1 year. That was not just from Harris County, but Harris County was the biggest, contributor to that. And there's a number of reasons for that. When it's a big county, it's got, a big city, like there's just going to be more crime. And, a big reason, though, was also because smaller cities can't send people to death row as often because they just don't have the money for it. Because, a capital case, a capital trial is expensive. It's, 6 weeks, give or take. And we have separate phases for the guilt, innocence, and then the punishment. Mm-hmm. So you can make a shorter trial if you don't ask for the death penalty, because then they just get life without parole by default. So, between all the expert witnesses and the court costs and the, flying in all the people that need to be there for a trial, just the trial can get really expensive. And then you have all of the years of appeals that you have to, have your prosecutors be ready to be fighting appeals for a couple decades. Mm-hmm. So given the cost, a lot of smaller municipalities wouldn't be able to send people to death row at the rate that Harris County was, but I think one of the big things was also that for a quarter century, Harris County had one district attorney, Johnny Holmes, who really made ample use of the death penalty. He very much believed in capital punishment. And I think the culture of his DA's office contributed a lot to how Harris County became a place that was so deeply associated with capital punishment.
It's strange hearing it, because here in the UK, it's obviously it just doesn't happen anywhere. But we'll come back to it in a moment, Keri. So you say you're not originally from Houston. Where was home for you as a kid? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pennsylvania, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and and then I lived some in New Jersey and New York and a little bit in Massachusetts before I landed in Texas.
Your story struck me as an interesting and fascinating chain of events, Keri. What was young life like for you? Were your family religious in any way, or not?
So we did. My parents belonged to the church at the end of the street, and it was a Methodist church. I am not religious, so I did not spend any more time there than I was forced to. But I, a lot of my time growing up was I was a competitive figure skater. And so I would leave school every day around 10 or 11 in the morning and go to the rink and train for 5 or 6 hours. And I skated pairs, which is where the, guy throws you around and it looks all dangerous and shit. And am I allowed to swear on this? I didn't even ask.
You just did.
Right. So I skated pairs and we competed at nationals twice. And that was sort of my whole life growing up, was just skating and competing and trying to fit in.
I guess that was quite intense, was it? You say 5 or 6 hours training. That's we're talking serious expectations there, I guess.
Yeah, it was, aside from the on ice training, there's off ice lift classes and ballet, and you have to work out and do extra cardio and stuff. So it's being an elite athlete at that age is very all consuming, and it was sort of my whole identity and my whole idea for what my future would be. And then when my pair partner decided to branch out and find another partner, I just sort of fell apart. At that point I was 17 and just really sort of didn't have the coping skills to deal with that sort of loss, because it's sort of like if you I don't know, get fired from your job and also every job forever is what it felt like, because it was like, not only was I losing this partnership, but I also was losing my best friend. And also I should say we weren't actually like best friends, but the person I spent the most time with, I guess I should say. So, I was losing one of my friends, and then also knowing that this might be the end of my career, because there's so many more women in skating than there are men, that he could find a pair partner the next day. And, he found one very quickly. And I didn't know if I would, that season or ever. And when it became clear that I was going to end up taking at least a season off from competing because I didn't find a partner, that was the thing that I was like, I just fell apart, because in skating, your career is so short to begin with, that at 17, it felt like a year off was going to be the end of my career and sort of the only future I envisioned for myself. So I ended up, I went to Harvard summer school. My parents sent me to Harvard summer school because they thought that I would, I don't know, get myself together and stop, crying every night.
Did you see that coming, Keri? Was it kind of, did it just happen, or was there a breakdown in relationships, or was it just not working out, or did it come as a complete shock to you?
I mean, it came as a complete shock to me and to my coach. She was not expecting that. I don't know. I mean, he was 19. Like, I don't know. Maybe there were other reasons, and being a 19-year-old guy, he wasn't communicating them. Or, I mean, maybe he just wanted to, try a different route, try a different partner, see if someone else worked better. We've talked about it since then. We're still in touch. We talk now. We weren't for many years, but we talk now. And, he doesn't, I think looking back, he seems to feel like there are other reasons that didn't really come up at the time. So I think, we've all sort of remembered it a little differently 20 years on. But at the time, it was not at all clear to me what the reasoning for that was. And, I fell apart and started doing drugs after that.
Was that quite quickly afterwards, Kerry? How long after that breakup did you start taking drugs? And did you go straight for the heavy artillery, or were you just dabbling at that point?
So our last competition would have been nationals in February of, I guess, 2001. And then he, said we were going to go separate ways shortly thereafter. And, I was just sort of moping around the house, crying every night, like just, combination of like very depressed human and dramatic teen sort of all rolled into one very emo and insufferable ball. And then by the summer, when my parents thought that the way to sort of get me back on track would be to send me to Harvard summer school, because there was a skating rink in walking distance, and it's Harvard, like, yay. It seemed like this would be something that would give me something else to focus on, because I also did well in school. I was interested in academics and stuff. And instead, it meant that this was the first time that I had basically no parental supervision, because my life had been very regimented in skating. And my parents were pretty strict. So this was the first time I could do normal kid things. Like, I wasn't the kid that was going to a party and, were sneaking beers out of, dad's liquor cabinet or whatever, because I just didn't have a social life because I was skating. And then suddenly I had all complete freedom. And, I just sort of used that freedom to self-destruct. I was in a very depressed place. And that summer, I tried drugs a few times. I tried pot, I tried ecstasy, and then pretty quickly, right after the summer, went straight to heroin. I was actively looking to be self-destructive at that point.
Did you, at any point when that was going on, Kerry, think, I need to pull back from this? Or were you intent on a one-way ticket to self-destruction?
I was in a very dark place. I wasn't thinking I needed to pull back. And also, I think part of it was that I was so young and everything seemed so black and white, when you're 17. And also, I think, I've always sort of been all or nothing in a lot of ways. I was all or nothing about sort of skating, and then about drug use after it. And, I put a lot into my, career as a reporter. So I think I've always been a little bit of a sort of all or nothing person. But in addition to that, I was in a place as a 17-year-old where I was depressed and thinking in very black and white terms. And so when I sort of set my sights on like self-destruction, I shouldn't say set my sights on. I'm not sure it was like so like intentional, this is what I want to do, but it was just like I don't know, like a dog crawling under the porch to die. Like, I just wanted to go implode somewhere far away. So after that summer at Harvard, I got into a fight with my parents, and depending on who you ask, I either ran away or got kicked out, and ended up spending most of my senior year, or half my senior year, living on the streets, and just sort of continuing to fall apart.
When you left home, was that because they were aware of your drug use?
I think they suspected it, but that's not what the fight was over.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
and Kerry, just tell us about, you're going from this kind of, and I've spoken to a few elite athletes, and I kind of get a picture that it's very intense, and the expectation's very high, and the work ethic is kind of there. And then you briefly said that you're an academic. Just share with people, because there's lots of people who watch this who I know are addicts, who from my own community, to go from that to become an addict and then to find yourself living on the street. What was that like? Was there any fun in that, or were you just living in a circle of desperation?
No, there was definitely no fun in that.
It wasn't like
I got into drugs for an escape. I
No.
didn't, this wasn't like, oh, I did ecstasy at a party for fun. Like this, this wasn't like I was like, oh, let me try heroin because it seems like a good escape. Like that wasn't, it wasn't fun, and I don't think I expected it to be. I was just, it was like a slow motion suicide attempt, really.
Did you feel in community with other drug users, Kerry? That's something that strikes me here, is that quite often these individuals are a kind of part of a wider group. Were you in community with other drug users as you were?
Yeah, that's it. That's an interesting question. So, yes and no. On the one hand, I feel like I came into that with so little social skills because I've been so involved in this intense elite athletics and hadn't really done the normal childhood socializing, that I think I actually learned a lot about sort of just basic social skills from drugs. But at the same time, there's limits to the community you're finding as a homeless 17-year-old female, because everything's a threat. Obviously, well, I say obviously, but maybe it isn't obvious. I ended up in lots of positions where, I was raped and assaulted in various ways, multiple times over the course of that. I was also doing sex work. I was, doing sex work in Boston's Chinatown, because as a 17-year-old, I couldn't just get a job. Like I was a minor. So legal employment was not really an option. So I ended up doing sex work, and I was sleeping. There was a sort of commune situation under a train station, the Alewife train station, which is at the end of the line on the Boston subway, which is called the T. So the last T stop on the red line is Alewife. And there's a parking garage right across the street from the station. And it's one of those ones that like curls up like in a cylinder, and under the first curl up, there was a little door and you could get in. Mm-hmm. And there was a whole bunch of people that would sleep there and, called themselves the family. And there were some of the like, they had weird sort of ranking system. There were nobles and there was like a king and queen. And if you weren't part of the royalty, you had to like ask permission to sleep there. And, they were hardcore goth. Like, I don't even know how to describe this, like colonial goth, like white faces with like black colonial looking goth attire. I don't even think the people at the top I don't even know if they were actually homeless. But so I stayed with them some. And on the one hand, like it was shelter. It was a place that was not fully exposed. And at 17, again, there's limited options for shelters. A lot of the regular shelters wouldn't take a lone 17-year-old at that point. So I didn't have a lot of options, and it did provide some things, and then there's of course things that it just doesn't provide. Like it doesn't actually provide a safe harbor from, a certain type of predatory male, because obviously some of the people that were there were older predatory males. So, is there community in drug users? Yeah, there's some, but there's always, there's always some limits to that.
I recently interviewed a musician, Kerry, who had troubles with addiction. And I asked him what his kind of epiphany moment was to kind of get him into recovery. And he said, I had to find where my knees were. And when I found where my knees were, then I could start to find my way back up again. What was your knees on the floor moment? Was it being caught by the police, or had it already hit you by then, or not?
I think that by the time I got arrested, which was, much later, I was 26. I think by the time I got arrested, I was sorry, that's my
okay. Keep going.
Dog objects, I guess.
We don't mind on the dog.
Maybe the mailman's here, I don't know. But I think by the time I got arrested, I had to some extent matured, in that, to some extent you statistically mature out of, crime. And I think that was part of it. but I think I'd also gotten to a point where I was just, I had had enough. Like I had been through enough bad shit over the course of almost a decade at that point, that I was ready to, I was ready to do something different. And I think all I needed sort of was something that would be a catalyst to that. And that could have been, I think, moving to another town, graduating, like many things. But, I got arrested. And after that, you can, of course, still, I think some people think that, oh, you got arrested, you're in jail. That's the thing that forces you to get sober. But jail does not force you to get sober, because there are drugs you can find just as well in prison and jail as you can on the street. I could get heroin delivered to my bedside in prison. People offered to, get needles. Like, this is not some surefire means to sobriety. In fact, for a lot of people, feel that there's just nothing else to do when you're locked up other than drugs. So for me, I think the thing that solidified that I was ready to be done was after I got arrested. There were two sort of moments that really stand out to me. And one was probably a few weeks after I got arrested, when someone else had smuggled drugs in and the whole rest of the cell block was high. And I noticed it because I was sitting there writing a letter, and suddenly I was like, it is so quiet in here. And I realized that's because everyone had either gone out to rec or they were passed out in their bunks. And I was just like, wow, it feels so good right now to not be that person. Like, I'm not worried about, am I going to get caught? I'm not worried about, am I going to be in solitary tomorrow because they're going to find my supply? I'm not worried about, how do I find more? How do I pay this person back? And that felt really good. It felt good to be the person who was, for once, the one doing the right thing instead of the person who's embarrassing everyone else in the room.
Yeah.
And so that was one moment. And then a few weeks, maybe a few months after that, I was still dating this guy that I'd been dating before I got arrested. In fact, my dumb ass got married to him while I was in jail. Okay. I got married in the jail visiting room, and he continued visiting me, and eventually he started coming in high. And, obviously I know what high looks like. By that point, I'd been doing drugs for like 9 years. I know what high looks like. And, he came in and had visible track marks and blood on his arm. And I was like, what's that? And he's like, oh, I fell into a pot plant. He's saying the pot plant stabbed him on his vein. And, and I was just watching him tell these lies again and again. And I was just like, I don't want to be that person anymore. Like, I don't want to be that person who's lying to everyone around me. I'm seeing from the other side how ridiculous all the same sorts of lies that I told clearly look. And, I was so glad not to be that. And I didn't want to be that. So that was another big moment for me in terms of just having the will to decide this is what I wanted to do. Of course, actually carrying it through and having the, resources and support and, ability to build your life back up afterwards are a whole other kettle of fish. But I think those were two of the really formative moments for me in terms of deciding that this is, that I wanted to stop being a fuck up.
Keri, just listening to you talk, I interviewed, I don't know if you know Morgan Godwin.
I love her. Yes. She's great.
And I'm just wondering what your thoughts were about kind of an individual's ability to kind of recover themselves. Morgan told me that when she went to prison, it was pretty hopeless. There was really nothing. There was no kind of courses or classes to help her get better or work, learn English or maths or whatever. But she learned to speak Spanish through the other inmates. And I think there's something about the individual's kind of what you find within yourself to get through these situations. And you've talked about a few things there. What was there anything that you found reassuring about being in prison or actually useful? Or was it a case of what I'm going to get out of this? I'm going to get out of it myself and nobody's actually going to give it to me.
I'm trying to think of if there was a single useful thing in prison, and I can't, there's nothing that is coming to mind.
Really?
But the other thing is, like, even for the people, because for some people there can be an occasional useful thing. I think that some people that get into these programs where they're training, rescue dogs, or where they're working as, like, firefighters fighting forest fires in California, because 80% of the firefighters that fight California wildfires are prisoners who are getting paid, $1 or $2 a day or whatever. But those jobs, as much as problematic as they are from a prison labor standpoint, for some people are very meaningful and can provide skills and, like, this sense that you're actually doing something worthwhile, when the alternative is to just sit in a cell and do nothing.
Mhm.
So, I mean, even for those people, though, even if you do happen to be lucky enough to be in a prison where you're able to get something positive out of it, which is not the vast majority of American prisons, mind you, even in those situations, the trauma of incarceration and just the things that are done to you on a daily basis is, I think, overwhelmingly outweighs any possible good. I think when people think of prison, a lot of times they sort of think that, oh, okay, you're sitting in a cell block or whatever, but you get 3 warm meals, 3 hots and a cot. You just sort of wait, like, you probably call your parents and, watch TV and shit. And that is not really representative of what prison is.
No.
Because prison includes things like solitary confinement, which is so much worse than I think a lot of people imagine it is. And, the idea that you get 3 hots and a cot is questionable at best. A lot of people throughout the pandemic that I've talked to in prisons have been, having issues with not getting fed for 12 hours at a time. They're getting woken up every 2-3 hours for count. You are, you're constantly under the threat of, assaults of, there's fires in the tiers all the time. I mean, prisoners will get desperate enough that they start fires to get the guards to come and feed them because the guards are ignoring them. So I have done some reporting on this where I have, all this video of people just, these fires burning for hours inside in cell blocks, because the guards were ignoring prisoners. And I mean, I can just go on and on with sort of the ways in which the typical conditions of prison add trauma. You're taking someone who's already probably had a traumatic and not great life, might have some mental health issues, probably has some addiction issues, and you're putting them in a situation where instead of giving them life skills, you're compounding trauma.
Yeah.
So, I think even in situations when you get something out of prison, it's almost always outweighed by the things that are taken away.
So bearing that in mind, with those circumstances and that those surroundings, how did you find your sobriety? What was the key to that success?
So, when I got out, I think that I was incredibly lucky to have support. A lot of people come out with nothing. They get the $40 of gate money that you get when you're released, and that's more or less it. I was very lucky to have a place to stay and, have parents who would help support me. And because of those things, I was able to look for a job. And it took me a while because I didn't have a car. I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no bus stop. It's upstate New York. And I lived in a town with like 1 stoplight. And so, it was hard, even so, to start over. But because I had support, I was able to, finish school. I was able to get a job. And I think that finding a job that I was able to really derive meaning out of and really immerse myself with, I think that has been huge. I sometimes joke that I didn't get sober so much as I found a more socially acceptable addiction than heroin, which is, I mean, for me, journalism and covering prisons, writing about prisons, is something that I sort of put my whole self into.
Yeah, I'll come on to that in a second, Kerry. Just a quick one to kind of wrap up the matter around addiction. As part of that healing and recovery from addiction, was there any? Were you seeking redemption? Did you go about and seek forgiveness from people that you may have felt that you'd hurt during that experience? You know, it was lovely to hear that you came out and your parents were still there. Was there guilt and anxiety brought about by this?
So, I think that some of those things are a little trickier with addiction. It's very clear cut with, like, violent crime or something. You know who the victim is and who you're apologizing to, right? For me, I mean, there are some people that I felt that I needed to make amends to in some way, but I think in a lot of cases, those people more or less just were like, the amends is that you're doing well and you're not doing that anymore. But I also think that with addiction, a lot of times, I mean, I guess the framing of amends in the context of addiction is, I guess, something that I feel like we should interrogate a little differently, because, addiction is a brain disorder. It's a mental health issue. And the presumption that that is the starting place, making amends, I think is not always applicable. Like for me, yes, there are people that I needed to make amends to. But the way that I think recovery circles have focused on amends so heavily, I'm not sure that's always the relevant thing in the context of addiction. Because to some extent, addiction, you're also harming yourself a lot. You're ending up in a lot of scenarios where, you've been traumatized, victimized, raped, whatever. So I feel like the focus on amends is sort of not the full picture. Did I have people I said amends to? Yeah, but I also feel like, to me, the more important form of amends came much further down the road, and it wasn't something that I actively sought and didn't realize until I was doing it. And that has been covering prisons. I didn't get out and say, I need to give a voice to the people who are experiencing this thing that I experienced and are, have typically been ignored by the media and are typically mistrusted and not listened to. I didn't actively say that. But then when I started in journalism, and I eventually got into criminal justice reporting, and I eventually realized that I was giving a voice to people that were not getting covered or heard and were living in some truly terrible conditions and, being treated in ways that are simply counterproductive to public safety. Then at that point, I think I started to really feel these were more the sort of broad scale amends that I needed to make, because so many of my amends didn't feel like they were restricted to like individuals. I didn't break into houses. I didn't do a lot of these sort of clear victim crimes. So much of the harm that I did was in the sort of broader sense of, like, I was doing drugs and just being a not positive force in the community.
Yeah. I've got to ask you this. It's fascinating stuff, Kerry. I'm so delighted you've been so honest about these things. What about your parents? Did they feel guilt? Did they, did they feel they'd let you down in any way? What was that kind of relationship like when you came out from prison? Was that a difficult period as well?
I mean, I think that my parents like to sort of keep to themselves to some extent. They've generally not wanted to be a part of it if someone's doing a profile on me or something. So I try not to say too much about their piece. Like, obviously, I wrote a book that's coming out next year. They appear in it at times, but sort of as minimally as I possibly could.
Yeah.
But I will say that, and I say this in the book as well, that when I was in prison, I at some point started sort of adopting this policy of being like radically honest with them, like telling them every fucking terrible, awful thing, like whatever, I'm on outside work crew, and the girl that I'm assigned with like is having sex with the guard every day, and instead of mowing the lawn, I'm just playing lookout. Or, you know, this guard is always sexually harassing people, asking them to take off their clothes. Or, you know, I, you know, told them I got Hep C. Like I was just sort of telling them everything, the sorts of things that I might not have told them because I was withholding things before, or that I just thought they wouldn't want to hear because it was just, you know, offensive or shitty or whatever. But I would just tell them everything. And I think that they understood at some point that I was telling them so much that like they could trust that they were actually getting the truth. But even so, no matter what you say in prison, I'm sure that they were nervous when I got out, because you never really know if any amount of sort of radical honesty or self-searching or, you know, growth or anything is really going to translate to the outside. Because, you know, whatever lessons you learn in prison, like prison is an artificial environment. It doesn't exist. It doesn't, the lessons you learn there don't necessarily translate at all.
Yeah. And your job now as a journalist, you know, I sometimes think that British media is quite narcissistic, and you know, some of it's just absolutely dreadful. But I think there's a real need for journalists who are prepared to bring matters of importance to the surface. Do you feel you have an ear? Do you think people want to hear these stories? They want to be made aware of issues within prisons and death penalty and things like that. You feel like you're getting an ear?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, a lot more than 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, I think we're at a moment here where people are a lot more willing to pay attention to criminal justice issues, and not just since, you know, last summer's protests, but in the years prior to that. I mean, honestly, I think Orange is the New Black, and had a huge impact in terms of people's willingness to be interested in prisons, and specifically women's prisons. Also, I think Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, had a huge role in raising, you know, cultural awareness, or raising sort of broad awareness of the ways that race played into mass incarceration, and just sort of how vast the systemic problems were. So these things, I think, have contributed to a media environment where people are a little more willing to read stories about prisons than they maybe used to be. But in terms of death penalty, I actually think there might be less interest in capital punishment than there used to be. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but you can see it even in the amount of media coverage. At executions in Texas, you know, 10, 15 years ago, you know, there were lots of protesters outside, and there were always, all the media spots were full. There's, you know, 5 media spots, and they were always full. And now they're frequently not all full, and the protesters are usually there, but much smaller in number. And I think that actually one of the places that still has a lot of interest in American executions is, you know, is UK and Europe actually as a whole. Europeans seem to have a lot of interest in American death penalty, to the extent that a lot of the guys on death row have European pen pals. Those are the people that tend to be sort of most appalled by the fact that this still exists, and that want to be involved in a hands-on way.
There's definitely a morbid curiosity, I would say, in the UK. We do get from time to time documentaries of, you know, people like Louis Theroux talking to people on death row, and they're very interesting. But there is something a bit strange about them as well. And just finally, Kerry, thanks so much for your time. If you talked about, you know, that you didn't take anything positive from your time in America, and Morgan Godfrey said the same. Is that the case now? Or are American prisons generally still places of purely incarceration and little kind of preparation for life after crime, or has there been improvements in that system or not?
There have not been improvements. I would say it's only gotten worse.
Really?
Especially during COVID, but even before COVID. I mean, right before COVID, there were a whole spate of murders in Mississippi prisons. You'll remember, I don't, or maybe you won't. I mean, but this got a lot of play here. And then COVID hit, and everything got worse. There were at one point easily more than 300,000 people just in solitary, completely locked down, because many prisons responded to COVID by using solitary confinement to enforce, social distancing. And in some cases, people weren't being let out to shower for days at a time. They weren't consistently being fed. They were being fed things that wouldn't really resemble food. There were a lack of staff. The staff were calling out sick. Many prison systems are more understaffed than they've ever been. Texas prisons have never been as understaffed, for instance. And like I said, you had people increasingly lighting fires to get attention. There was an uptick in suicides in several prison systems. There's one situation I reported on where a guy killed his cellmate, and the guards didn't notice for 3 days that the man was dead.
Right.
Which is just shocking in terms of the sort of lack of, the lack of attentiveness. And I mean, they should have had required body counts, that you're supposed to do every day, every 6 times every day. And they somehow missed that one of the people they were supposed to count was dead. So I think that just the basic conditions of prison have gotten worse in many places. And, when you're just literally warehousing people in solitary confinement, they're definitely not getting any sort of adequate programming or any programming.
And that's a political decision, is it? That's a political choice to make, to do it that way. There is no kind of appetite to kind of heal people, get people better, get them ready for the next leg of their life.
Well, so I think that in some of the states that are more progressive, the solution has been to incarcerate fewer people. And even in Texas, we see this to some extent. Even in some of the southern states, the incarceration rates are not what they used to be. But, many of the southern states are just in a situation where their prison systems are big and expensive. Texas has about 117,000 prisoners right now. And, maintaining these crumbling buildings, some of which are 150 years old, some of them are just a few decades old, this is really expensive. So I think that given the costs of mass incarceration, it's not surprising that people are just not willing to spend what's required to make conditions better. And in the places that might be, they've often taken the approach of trying to focus on decarceration either instead or just sort of more prominently. There are some states where I think the conditions are getting better. Colorado prisons seem to be doing a great job. The San Diego County Jail seems to be doing some interesting things. There are places, a few places around the country that seem to be making an effort to do better. I think, Attica, which is obviously notorious for, the whole Attica riot or uprising. I think Attica is still quite bad, but much better than it was then. So there are some spots of improvement, but some of the places where things were the worst are still quite bad.
Kerry, it's been fascinating learning a bit about the American justice system. I really appreciate your honesty, telling us about your own story, and I'm delighted that things are going well for you over there. Have you ever been to the UK, Kerry? Is that something you've done?
I have not been to the UK, and you know what? I think that American felons are not allowed.
Not sure,
there's several countries I can't go to. I can't go to Canada or Australia, which I think is kind of ironic, but okay. I think I can't go to the UK either.
Okay. Oh, well, sorry for asking the awkward questions. Sorry. Kerry, thanks so much for coming on the Godcast. And if anybody else wants to check out any other interviews, got lots of interviews similar to this one with focusing on political matters and social justice issues, as well as musicians and singers. So, Kerry, I'll say thanks for coming on the Godcast, and we send our love to you from the UK. God bless.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.